the Paper Crafters Library. In this video I'm going to share with you a quick and easy technique using my Wow Puff embossing powders to emboss onto stretchy cotton fabrics. This is an easy way to dress up plain t-shirts, shorts, or other articles of clothing, like this little onesie that I'm going to show you how to decorate with this little star. So here I have this little onesie which I purchased at my local dollar store for only $2. As you can see, it's quite plain and simple, but I'm going to show you how easy it is to transform this using some of Wow's Puff embossing powders. You can create 2, 3, 4 of these, package them together, and you've got a beautiful gift that any mom-to-be would love to receive. So in addition to my onesie, the other supplies I'm going to use to create this project include a heavyweight piece of chipboard or cardboard, and it's just cut big enough to fit in between the front and back layer of the onesie. I've got a couple paint brushes in different sizes. If you have one, you may find it handy to have a craft blade. The pigment ink that I'm working with is this Pacific Point from Stampin' Up, and I have it in a little spot form. And I've also got the ink refill handy. Now the color of pigment ink I chose was based on the color of the Wow embossing powder puff powder that I chose, which is simply called blue, and this is what the color looks like. So as you can see, the two colors work together very nicely. I've got an anti-static bag. I'm going to be working, of course, over my coffee filter, and then today I'm going to be using a template, and the template that I'm using is a Crafters Workshop Basic Stars template. Now, if you're not familiar with heat embossing, I encourage you to watch our Basics of Heat Embossing videos. There's part 1 and part 2, and that'll tell you a little bit more about embossing, the basic tools, and how to actually do it. So let's get started with our project. So now to prepare my onesie, I've inserted my cardstock, my heavyweight cardstock piece in between the front and back layers, and that's simply to give me a nice rigid surface on which I can work. Now before I go ahead and apply my image, I'm going to take my anti-static bag and I'm just going to run it over the surface of my onesie to help minimize getting embossing powder where I don't want it. I find with the stretchy cotton fabrics, it has a tendency to really want to grab the embossing powder. Now, to create your image, you can use stamps or you can use a template. Of the two, my preference is to use a template. With a stamp, you're simply inking up the image and then applying it onto your surface. The only problem with that is that you really have to make sure you get enough ink on your stamp, and it's kind of a one-shot deal. When you get it down, if you don't have enough ink, it's very hard to accurately go over it again. Now, you can with a Stamp-A-Ma-Jig, but I've had sometimes if my hand moved a little bit or if my stamp jiggled a little bit, then double stamping or triple stamping my image isn't quite accurate enough. So that's the reason that I like to use my template, because I have more control. I can place my template onto my surface, and then I can apply as much ink as I want. And as I mentioned, the more ink that you have, the more surface, I guess you could say, your embossing powder has to stick to. So I'm just going to take this star template. Again, as I think I mentioned earlier, it's a Crafters Workshop template, and I'm just going to place it over the onesie, and I'm going to take my spot, and while I hold my onesie and my template in place, I'm going to press down on my spot onto the onesie underneath. And as you can see, it's really saturating the onesie material. I'm going to carefully remove my onesie. You can see I have this, or not my onesie, my template. You can see I have this really nice, crisp star image. And I'm going to take my blue puff embossing powder and just sprinkle it all over. You want to make sure that your whole image is covered with the embossing powder. Then I'm going to just fold my onesie over. I think I might slide this down just to make it a little bit easier. And then I'm going to very carefully tip this over my coffee filter to remove the excess embossing powder. So initially, at first glance, I guess, when you first tip your embossing powder off and you first give your fabric a few flicks, you can see it does quite a nice job of taking off any excess embossing powder. Now, if there's areas that don't come off, or little bits of embossing powder, you can use here. There's like a little bit there. I'm going to see if I can get it off with tweezers. If that doesn't work, that's when I come in with my craft knife, because I can get nice and close with my craft knife and just brush it away from the edge. And then once I've moved it away from the edge, I can then come in with my little brush and then just very carefully try to brush away excess embossing powder. Now the nice thing is, if it's just tiny little flecks of embossing powder, even once it's heated, you can scrape it off with a craft knife. You don't want to have to do too much of that though. That's only for the really tiny flecks that it comes off easily like that. So then once you've taken the time to remove any excess flecks and you've cleaned up any edges that you need to clean up, at this point we're ready to heat emboss this. So I've zoomed in close so you can see what happens as I'm embossing this. I'm going to turn on my heat tool. I'm holding it a couple of inches away from the embossing powder. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice that's really cool about this powder is when you apply it, it's almost onto fabric. It's almost like you start to see these little fibers. It's like you see these little fibers sticking up in the air. And I think that's just from the puff embossing powder itself. Now, puff embossing powder is designed to expand, to puff up essentially, that's where it gets its name from, and expands 3 times higher than WOW's regular embossing powders. Now I've noticed that there's a big difference between using the puff embossing powder on fabric and on paper. Somehow on fabric it gets even higher than it does on paper. Now you can see here as it's heating that the color is changing. It's becoming a much lighter color, and I'm just angling my heat tool in different directions. I'm trying to come around from the edge here so that you can watch the process of the embossing powder heating. As you can see, I mean, I've been doing this live, so you can see exactly how long approximately this is going to take to heat and how long it's going to take to melt. And you just want to keep an eye on your image, and you want to make sure that the whole thing completely puffs up. And you'll notice if you look closely, because you will have ended up with this lighter blue color. Anywhere where it seems to be a little bit darker, just take your heat tool and position it over there. You'll also notice a change in the texture. It'll go from looking very granular to looking, well, I don't really know any other word to use than puffy. So there you can see what that looks like. You can see that really awesome texture on there. Now I'm just going to give this a moment to set. With heat embossing, of course, it does heat to high temperatures. Embossing powders, well, WOW embossing powders melt around 275 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is going to take a few moments to cool down. So you don't want to stick your fingers into that because you can burn your fingers. So once your embossing powder is cool, that's when you can go in either with a craft knife to sort of clean up any edges, or you can even go in with a pair of tweezers to pick off if you see any little kind of stray flecks of embossing powder that you missed when you were getting off all the embossing powders. You can see here, you can pick it off from around the edges quite easily. So how perfect you want to be really totally depends on you and your patience for doing that. But if you look at it, even with just very minimal cleanup of the edges, you get an absolutely beautiful image with a really cool texture. Now here's what I love about this puff embossing powder. You can see cotton is stretchy. So if you can see as I grab and I'm stretching, you can see when you let go, it pops right back to its original shape. So you don't notice anything. You can't stretch, you can't crack, you can't wreck your puff embossing powder. The other thing is that this is machine washable. Of course, if you're working on fabric that you're planning on wearing, it has to be. So there you can see what my completed onesie now looks like. Super cute, just with the addition of 1 star. And of course, you can do as much as you want. With this, you can put more images. You could use alphabet stencils or alphabet stamps to stamp the baby's name. Really, sky's the limit. It's a fantastic way of dressing up plain and simple, stretchy cotton clothing that you have.